If you have closely studied the history of Russia's relationship with the West, one thing that becomes evident to you is that the country has had a somewhat never-ending cycle of a love-hate relationship with the West, cooperating and trying to become like Western Europe at times, and violently resisting any perceived erosion of sovereignty and identity.
If you have perceived so, you're not alone. Such a pattern was also noted by Vadim Tsymbursky, a Russian political scientist and scholar of geopolitics.
You're listening to Strategic Wisdom with Andrew Jose. Strategic Wisdom is a foreign affairs and politics podcast brought to you by Andrew Jose, a Washington, D.C.-based security policy analyst and news reporter, bringing you timely commentary on issues in international relations, war, and security policy. We're your hosts, Ian Stormfeld
and Gabriel Savchuk. Joining Andrew today is Gordon Hahn, a scholar of Russian and Eurasian politics, to discuss Tsymbursky's theorization of cycles in relations between Russia and the West, and how Tsymbursky's ideas can be adapted and applied to understanding Moscow's current approach to Washington, London, and Brussels.
Hahn is the author of Neo-Tsymburskian Cycles in the History of Russian-Western Relations, an essay published by the journal Russia in Global Affairs. This essay forms the main subject of Andrew's discussion with Dr. Hahn today.
Without further ado, we're going to hand the floor to Andrew Jose.
Gordon Hahn is an expert analyst at Corr Analytics, a New York-based political risk advisory firm. Hahn is a notable scholar of politics, international relations, and Islamist terrorism in Russia and Eurasia. He is the author of The Russian Dilemma: Security, Vigilance, and Relations with the West from Ivan III to Putin, and Ukraine Over the Edge, Russia, the West, and the New Cold War. Hahn's most recent work is Russian Tselostnost, Wholeness in Russian Culture, Thought, History, and Politics. He has previously taught at Boston University, American University, and Stanford University. He has also served as a visiting fellow at the Kennan Institute in Washington, D.C., and the Hoover Institution. Gordon Hahn, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you for inviting me. Glad to be here.
In your recent essay for Russia and Global Affairs, Dr. Hahn, you mentioned Neo-Tsymburskian Cycles in the history of Russia's relationship with its Western counterparts. Could you explain to the audience what are Tsymburskian cycles and what are Neo-Tsymburskian cycles, and how do the Neo-Tsymburskian cycles differ from Tsymbursky's original theorization of the cycles of Russia's relationship with the West?
Tsymbursky's original cycles were devoted entirely to foreign relations, that is, relations mostly with the West that he touches on, Eurasia and Eurasia. He argued that there were three different cycles in Russian history with the West and in relations with the West, and each cycle had five what he called moves. So move A typically saw Russia becoming sort of a secondary ally of some European alliance, one or another. Then move B came in two forms in which the failure of Russia's, shall we say, unsuccessful, unfortunate involvement in these geopolitical alliances leads to the European conflict extending into Russia in one of two ways, either an invasion by a European hegemon or one or more, two or more parties to the dispute bring the dispute into Russia, the fight into Russia, the conflict into Russia. That's move B. Move C is a Russian counteroffensive. The Russians regroup and try to, quote unquote, catch the aggressor in his lair, and they invade, seize a protectorate in some territory beyond Eastern Europe, and hope to use that to project its Russian power. Move D is the West consolidates and conducts a counteroffensive, pushes Russia back behind the Baltic, Black Sea line dividing Eastern Europe from Western Europe, you could say, or Eastern Europe from Eurasia, depending on the period and your point of view. And Russia is now cut off from its European other, or Europe is cut off from its Russian other, as Russians see Russia as being part of Europe usually, and some Europeans do as well. And this leads to a kind of catastrophic isolation. And then move E is Russia responds to the situation by turning to Asia or Eurasia in what Tsymbursky called a Eurasian intermediate. We could call it a Eurasian interval or a Eurasian alternative. And then the free cycle lasted from beginning with the Napoleonic Wars circa 1820 to the defeat of Russia in the Japanese War in 1906. Cycle 2 extends from 1907 to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939 through World War I. That is, and leading to World War II. And then cycle 3 leads from the Great Patriotic War, what the Russians call the Great Patriotic War, World War II, to the post-Soviet Russia. And so what I tried to do is add the domestic factor into the cycles and come up with my own cycles. So they do not correspond to Tsymbursky's cycles chronologically or temporally or in terms of the period, and they also differ in that they take into account domestic changes that are either a result of foreign involvement or preparation for involvement in relations with Europe. So I argued there were 4 cycles, each had 4 phases. In the first phase, you have a traditionalist status, typically a traditionalist status quo, which typically in Russia would mean some form of authoritarian rule, except for the Soviet period, a reliance on Russian orthodoxy, a preference for national unity as opposed to pluralism, and a post-conflict standoff with the West. That's phase 1. Phase 2 is some kind of westernization or liberalization domestically, at the same time a rapprochement with the West or elements thereof. 4-3 is the West typically then overplays its hand, and there's either a military invasion or some other operational or political intervention. Before that, there may be influence and an attempt to maximize that influence. There may be forms of meddling in the internal politics, and this leads to a Russian reaction. And domestically, this means a de-Westernization and a re-traditionalization of Russia. So that's phase 3, and then phase 4 is the last in any cycle, and it's a Russian counteroffensive in which it regroups. Engages either in military action or some other military political or military geostrategic action against the West. And then there's a restoration of something that's close to what had been the Russian tradition in the previous at the beginning of the cycle. So there's a sort of a traditional or a neo-traditional restoration. And then I delineated 5 cycles as far as I could make out. And the first is from 1505 with the establishment of the Muscovite kingdom to 1630 and the restoration of the creation of the restoration of Russian stability and the creation of the Romanov dynasty in the period 1615 to 1630, you could say. And then cycle 2 is 1630 to 1825. That is from the end of the Smuta and the establishment of the Romanov dynasty to Nicholas I's defeat of the Decembrist revolt and movement. Third cycle is 1826 to 1922, Nicholas's reign to the end of the Russian Civil War, marking the consolidation of Bolshevik rule. Cycle 4 is from 1922, leading through to approximately 2008, the mid early Putin era. And so I argue there's actually now a 5th cycle has begun, and that is the restoration of a sort of tradition, neo-traditional system under Putin that harkens back more to the pre-imperial period in terms of political structure with some democratic elements, quasi-democratic elements, and a return to conflict with the West, and an about face, as in the Tsymbursky cycle, to Eurasia, with Neo-Eurasianism, and then the attempt to construct things like BRICS, and then militarily the incorporation of Crimea in 2014, and the beginning of a sharp turn toward Russian-Western relations. So that's basically my 5 cycles.
One question I had when looking at your research and also Tsymbursky's original theory, is it a valid assumption to make that we went through another revolution and by revolution I'm referring to the start of one cycle till about the middle or end of one cycle, from the end of the Soviet Union with Russia trying to reach out to the West and work with the Western system to Ukraine? Would it be reasonable to say that the fall of the Soviet Union sort of marked the start of a new revolution of the cycle rather than being part of the macro cycle exclusively?
Well, the collapse of the Soviet Union, if using my model, right, you have the perestroika period and the post-perestroika period, which were periods of westernization and liberalization, right? And at the same time, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the establishment of a quasi-democratic system, nascent democratic system under in the new Russia, the problem that emerged was that NATO expansion began. So this was perceived by Russians as another, so we say, West overplaying its hand in a period of westernization, which is what I talked about as being phase 3, I believe, of a cycle. So I mean phase 4. So what we're seeing now here is post perestroika and the perestroika period were kind of we're phase 2, right? You have a democratization, liberalization. Then you have NATO expansion continuing. This is seen as a reaction. And then when Putin restores a more authoritarian system and then begins to move against the West geostrategically, you have a shift now to the first phase of cycle 5. So really the Soviet period, the perestroika and post-perestroika period are really phase 4 of the 4th cycle.
The war in Ukraine, what phase of the cycle do you think it is characteristic of? And based on your model and research, what might we expect from this cycle we are in, considering the current geopolitical climate? Not to be a doomer, but is this phase the phase to end all phases?
We're here with the reactions. This is part of the counteroffensive by Russia in a phase 4 that leads to the first phase of 5th cycle. So it's hard to make a neat cutoff, right, between, say, phase 4 of cycle 3 and phase 1 of cycle 4. In this case, we're talking about phase 4 of cycle 4 and phase 1 of cycle 5, if one buys my interpretation, right? So the Ukraine is a continuation, really, of this pushback against the West that forced Putin then to move in a more authoritarian direction. And, Crimea, the Georgian War going. That's why I designate the beginning of the 5th phase to 2008, is that the Georgian War really is the first major pushback by Russia. A lot of words about we don't want NATO expansion, problems during the Yugoslav wars and so forth and so on. But Russia really never undertook any major step to counter NATO expansion until the Georgian War occurred. So that's why I designate 2008 really as a beginning. One can argue it's 2014 with Maidan and the reaction to Maidan. That is the beginning of the 5th cycle. So Ukraine fits into the end, really the end of the 4th cycle and the beginning of the 5th cycle. And we can see this evidence of this in that simultaneous with the problems in Georgia and Ukraine, we see Russia turning to adopting more of this idea, this Neo-Eurasian, I wouldn't call it a state ideology, but an ideology, and elements of them certainly influence Putin's thinking Now we can see this in BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and various other Russian policies where Russia is now really feels, and it is in fact cut off from Europe because of the invasion in Ukraine, and is now returning to a sort of Eurasian interval that Tsymbursky described. And this is really if you look at it in Tsymbursky's terms, right? They're pushed back essentially at the Black Sea, Baltic Sea line. And again, you have this turn to BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, an attempt to build basically a counter-alliance to NATO.
Could you elaborate on this concept of ontological security, which, according to your essay, influences Russia's approach to the West? What is it exactly, and what are some modern-day examples of policy decisions by Russia in pursuit of ontological security?
Right. So, given this to and fro between traditionalists and then periods, and then more reformist periods like the perestroika and post-perestroika, or if you go back earlier, the period of Alexander II's reign, or the first part of Alexander I's reign. Other than those periods of reform, there's sort of a classic idea of what is Russian national identity. So one classic example would be Nicholas I's official nationality, right? The idea that the Russian style of life, which is called nationality, or in Russian, narodnost, under the official nationality of Nicholas I, right? And then the orthodoxy as one element, and then autocracy, or in modern terminology, authoritarianism, right? And that's sort of the Russian tradition. There might be different variations on that theme, but that's the general idea. And so that is sort of a basic sort of a Russian national identity. It's not an ethno-national idea. It's more of a Russian cultural idea, form of identity, and often it's connected with the idea of Russia being part of an alternative civilization from Europe. At the same time, it is also being part of Europe. And so when the West comes in, and this gets to the whole problem of if one views Russia as being sort of paranoid and alien to all foreign influences, this is clearly an exaggeration, because Russia doesn't have this problem with non-Western civilizations. It has this problem only with Western civilization, because it's Western civilization that's constantly tried to influence, then meddle in or interfere in Russian politics. And if that doesn't work, then try to intervene or invade. And so this is, so when, for example, a period of reform begins and we begin to see Western influence, and it may be sponsored initially by the ruling elite, what typically happens is that the West tries to intensify that influence. And at some point, this becomes, mobilizes those who either at the beginning of the reforms or as the reforms began to radicalize, were suspicious or opposed to the reforms, raise the red flag, calls for a return to tradition or something like the previous tradition, depending on what period you're talking about. And so this is it's ontological security is basically the security of one's traditional national identity, not as an ethno-national entity, but as a civilization, in putting it briefly.
Another thing you mentioned in your essay, Dr. Hahn, is that Russia has a culture of security vigilance, which has shaped its approach to the West, particularly during Putin's presidency, Moscow's historical experiences with Mongols and Tatars, and also Napoleon. How do you think that these historical experiences have influenced the country's national psyche, to the extent that some claim that Russia has a fortress state mentality with suspicion towards other civilizations, but particularly other civilizations from the West? What do you think are the main historical events that framed or gave rise to this culture of security vigilance?
Mm-hmm. Largely, it's been relations with the West. If you go back to Russian history and relations with the West, it's there were problems early on, even before my cycles, and then in the first cycle, it was relations with Poland and the Vatican, and Vatican's attempts to expand Catholicism into traditionally Orthodox populations that neighbored Russia and that were ethnic, were Slavic and followed the Orthodox faith. And then it peaked with the first, with the project to place the so-called false Dmitry on the Russian throne after the death of Ivan III, so forth, and so forth, sponsored, where the Poles essentially created a invading army led by someone who was claiming to be the killed son of Ivan the Terrible, and that he was the rightful heir to the throne. And they sent this army into what is now Ukrainian territory, and interestingly enough, right? And they came up, moved up north, and then eventually seized Moscow. And this led to the time of troubles, which may have been the worst period in Russian history, in which you had chaos, roaming bands, Polish invasions, Swedish incursions, revolutionary activity, if you want to put it that way. The Soviets tend to play the whole thing up as a revolutionary episode, but that's not a clear, an accurate description of the thing. So this, the problem is that there's not a fortress mentality, but great suspicion, distrust, and in some quarters in Russia, even during periods of reform, people who absolutely despise the West and warn the liberals and reformers that this is going to lead to a crisis. But this is purely in relation to Western civilization. Russia doesn't have this problem for hundreds of years, except if you want to go back to the Mongols, right? But they don't have this problem with Hindu civilization. They don't have this problem with Chinese civilization. They don't have this problem with Muslim civilization. It simply doesn't exist. Russia, in this sense, for Europe, Russia is its main other. Russia's constantly viewing itself in relation to the West in terms of its sophistication, power, and so forth, development. And at the same time, it often wants to be part of Europe. And then there's some kind of episode which leads to a rejection, and then this becomes a backlash. And that's sort of what's covered in different way in my four cycles. So if you look at today, and you look at the BRICS, right? The four BRICS, the original four BRICS besides Russia represented basically all, except for the Muslim civilization, all the non-Western civilization, right? So Hindu civilization, China, Asiatic. Now they've brought in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So now there are Muslim representatives. All the civilizations, basic civilizations, if you want to consider Latin America a separate civilization, Latin America with Brazil, are represented in BRICS. It's the West that's not represented in BRICS. And there's a reason for that, because it's considered a counter to the West. And it's one that's becoming more and more robust, covering more and more spheres of political life. One can expect, in fact, at some point, a militarization, or at least the creation of a counter block to NATO, which already exists in economic terms and so forth, and so on. So this is dictated largely by historical experience. Again, the Smuta, then the Smuta was followed by the invasion of Napoleon. Invasion of Napoleon is followed by Hitler's invasion. And then NATO expansion occurs at the end of the Cold War, after Russia gave up 25 million of its ethnic Russian compatriots, Russian-speaking compatriots, and let them be separated from Mother Russia, to put it in Russian terms. Instead, and in reaction, instead of finding an open path to Europe, they found NATO expansion being discussed really within 2 years of the Soviet collapse, and within 5 years it was already on the table and a done deal, and with no geostrategic cause whatsoever. So this reinforced the traditionalist view and the security vigilance culture that's part of the traditionalist view in Russia, right? The idea that, and it played into those who were traditionalists in Russia who were fighting for power. And they are the ones who moved, if you look at the succession struggle to Yeltsin, the inner circle of Yeltsin we began to look for someone. This is almost a direct quote. We're looking for someone with epaulettes, someone with shoulder boards, either military or KGB, right, to replace Yeltsin, because we needed someone who would be looking out for Russian national security.
Moving away from Russia and looking at the West, what would you say are the factors influencing the West's approach, sometimes hostile towards Russia? Is it some sort of historical racism or dismissal of Russia's suitability for being part of, quote, Western civilization? What do you think are the factors that influences how the West perceives Russia?
I think all these things come into play. I think it began with more parochial or mundane things during the Clinton administration, when basically Clinton, first he needed credentials because he had been a draft dodger, and he needed defense credentials in terms of getting reelected. He needed the support of the defense industry, and he also needed the support of the state of Illinois, which has a large Polish and Ukrainian population. So for those three factors, I think, drove his agreement to expand NATO. I think it was largely domestic politics that drove it, because he was a governor from Arkansas. I don't think he had any grand international vision. And so all these domestic factors tended to trump any geostrategic concerns. And since Russia was weak at the time, those concerns were not particularly great in terms of some kind of Russian reaction. It was a gross misinterpretation of the situation and miscalculation, when in fact it was a possibility for the first time in 300 years, really, to bring Russia into Europe in important ways. So I think that started the ball rolling and sent things in a general direction. And then, as the situation in Yugoslavia was another factor that sort of began to kick in the old ideas of imperial and ethno-national competition between the West and Russia, and that began to touch on ideas of Russian national identity. And the more Russia began to look for an alternative non-Western alternative identity, then that provoked in the West the reaction: oh, see, the Russians are returning to their old colonial past, which in fact is not any different from the Western colonial past. The Russians, joined in the along with Western powers in the three partitions of Poland. And in fact, it was the West that often encouraged Russia to take up imperial operations, going back to Ivan III when they requested that Ivan III declare Moscow the successor to the Holy Roman Empire, and the Third Romans. And that whole idea, they encouraged that idea, which is now played up in the West, when in fact the idea, Ivan III rejected the idea, and the Third Rome idea remained as simply a sort of more of a religious political idea than a geopolitical idea, with absolutely no military, political, geopolitical implications involved. And so then you have other factors, right? Like in fact, the defense enterprise wanting to take over arms markets in Eastern Europe. And then you have the standard view of the Russians being second-tier Europeans, those other less sophisticated, less developed Europeans. And that's the most generous view that you'll often find in the West. Usually you'll hear them being referred to as Mongols and other such things. The Ukrainians use the words of vatniks and ladybugs and so forth and so on. So this is not unusual in certain circles of the West and its parlance. So there are all sorts of factors. There are cultural factors. There are factors of national superiority in the West. Economic factors, of course, also not just selling arms, but selling oil and gas and so forth. So, and then the bureaucratic interests and the electoral interests of Clinton administration going back early. So it's a complex picture. It's not one factor or another. That's the main thing. I don't think at this point you have security factors being at the fore, because you have an actual direct military conflict or almost direct military conflict in the NATO-Russia-Ukrainian war.
with the internal dynamics in Russia, one thing we noticed with the war in Ukraine is that the Chechens, notably Ramzan Kadyrov, has gained arguably influence in the current Russian political establishment. Do you think this influence on internal dynamics is significant enough to change certain things in this cycle?
No, I don't think. I think Kadyrov does not have any serious influence inside the Kremlin or anywhere else. He basically is someone who he's cut a deal with the Kremlin, and that is Chechnya can develop its own culture. It can ignore certain aspects of the Russian constitution and Russian law and promote Islam over other religions and institute elements of Sharia law and other cultural standards into Chechen life. It can violate the federal center's monopoly on the means of coercion by having this large military force under its control. And in return for that, they're supposed to serve Moscow's interests. So Kadyrov sends some of those troops into Ukraine to help the Russian cause in Ukraine. But Kadyrov, I think Kadyrov began Ramzan Kadyrov, that is, began following the model of his father and the words of his father, Ahmed Kadyrov, who said at some point, we spent 300 years trying to gain our independence by fighting the Russians. Maybe we should spend 300 years trying to gain our independence peacefully. And I think Kadyrov's playing that game. I think at this point, any idea of Chechen independence is out the window. There could be some opening for elements in Chechnya once Kadyrov is replaced or passes away. There are rumors that he has a severe kidney disease or diabetes, and his health is not all that well, and they're beginning to position people from his clan or other clans into a position to succeed him. But Kadyrov, he has very indirect influence in that he represents, in a way, an element of the Muslim population in Russia. He is can be seen as sort of containing radical Islamism and jihadism in the North Caucasus. But these are more services to the Kremlin than they are having any great influence. So I don't see him having influence in Kremlin policy in any way.
Coming to our last question, Dr. Hahn, are we doomed to go through this cycle repeatedly, or do you think there is hope for us as the West to break the cycle and have good relations with Russia? And if so, what actions should Western policymakers take to ensure that the relationship with Russia is more stable and peaceful instead of going through these regular cycles? Or do you think because of the powers that be, we're doomed to repeat the cycle?
Well, I don't think we're doomed to repeat the cycle eternally. I mean, there are always chances, and there's always political change. Politics is nothing. If it's nothing else, it's change. So, but I think for the next decade, situation is rather dismal. Basically, we're going to have to engage in conflict management. After this phase ends, and then there's some kind of semi-peaceful or peaceful standoff over the issue of Ukraine. The most important thing would be not to persist in expanding NATO. As long as the West persists in expanding NATO to Russia's borders, there is going to be conflict and potential conflict with Moscow, and there's no way getting around it. Because amongst the elite and in Russian society, they are very loath to see a large military alliance based in the West along its borders, and that's because of the history that I mentioned earlier. The other thing is, I think it would be good if both sides started to lay off the sort of the Macindarian geopolitical interpretation of geographical interpretation of politics, in which Russia and Eurasia are seen as the world island, and he who controls the world island controls the world. So the West is constantly trying to control the world island, and Russia constantly sees the West as trying to control the world island. And it would be good if we got a little bit away from that kind of thinking. Certainly, one can keep it in mind. It certainly is a factor in politics, but it shouldn't be a sort of an ideology that drives policy. So I think those are some of the things could be done. The other thing would be not to again, by doing things like NATO expansion, to insult Russian honor, by doing so kick in that security vigilance culture. It's better when that security vigilance culture is not the dominant culture, but it's recessive in the overall Russian culture. And those are the periods when there's accommodation with the West, there is Westernization, there's liberalization, and all those things we tend to support. One of the important things that people often overlook is that quite often Westernization and liberalization was undermined by Western actions. So if you look at Boris Godunov, who began to engage in reforms like Westernizing reforms that Peter the Great would implement a century later, and when he got wind of the conspiracy that the Poland and the Vatican were hatching regarding a false symmetry, he abandoned the reforms. Alexander I had planned a constitution and ending serfdom, and because of the conflicts with Napoleon and his involvement in the European alliances against Napoleon, he had to abandon that project twice, and then ultimately a third time. And then in the last 4 or 5 years of his reign, he became a conservative. One can look at the protection of Russian revolutionaries during the 19th century, leading up to the Russian Revolution. One can look at the German support when Kerensky was on the verge of creating possibly a Russian republic, the Germans sending Lenin with lots of money back into Russia to make a revolution. So all these examples are examples of the West actually undermining the Westernization that we say we want to see in Russia, so that Russia would become part of a West, and then we would have this sort of democratic peace that the Europeans love to talk about, in which everyone is a Republican or a Democrat in small d and all small r terms, and therefore there will be no conflict because it's only authoritarian leaders supposedly that create wars.
Ladies and gentlemen, you just listened to Gordon Hahn, expert analyst at Corr Analytics. Gordon Hahn, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
Strategic Wisdom with Andrew Jose is an initiative of Andrew Jose Media. The views expressed by guests on this show do not necessarily represent the official positions and opinions of Andrew Jose, Andrew Jose Media, and Strategic Wisdom.
Thank you for listening to Strategic Wisdom. Be sure to follow and subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you are using to listen to this show in order to not miss out any future interviews and conversations that Andrew Jose will bring to you on this podcast. We're streaming on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Yandex, JioSaavn, Amazon Music, and many other podcast streaming services. Also, be sure to subscribe to Strategic Wisdom on Substack at strategicwisdom.substack.com and to follow Strategic Wisdom on Twitter and Instagram at StratWisdom. Do support our work by buying from our merch store. For more details, visit strategicwisdom.substack.com.
Thank you so much, Gabby, and thank you so much, Ian. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your host, Andrew Jose, signing off.